BMW, Hugo Boss, Adidas, Fanta. Weird list, I know. I'll give you a moment to think about what they all have in common. Got a guess? Most people don't. All four grew and took shape inside Nazi Germany. BMW built engines for Nazi planes and motorbikes. Hugo Boss stitched the uniforms worn by SS officers. Adidas came from a workshop that supplied shoes for Nazi athletes and soldiers. And Fanta? The German Coca-Cola branch created it for the Nazi market. During the war, it was handed out to Wehrmacht units and even used as a little treat for SS staff. These aren't the only ones, not even close. And that's where things get uncomfortable. How many companies built their success under the Third Reich? Which inventions were pushed forward because the Nazis wanted them? And how did all of this survive the fall of the regime and slide right into modern life? It starts in 1941, inside Coca-Cola's German headquarters in Essen. The war had closed in, and the US trade embargo meant no more syrup from Atlanta. That syrup was the heart of Coca-Cola. Without it, the factories would go silent. Thousands of workers would be out of a job, and Max Keith, the man running Coke in Germany, would have to explain to the Nazi state why one of its most successful drinks had suddenly vanished from shelves. So he pushed for something new, not because he wanted to impress Berlin, but because he had to keep the lights on. Wheat was rationed, sugar was rationed, fresh fruit was rare. So the team dug through whatever the food industry had left. They pulled in whey from cheese factories, apple fibers left over from cider presses, fruit scraps that nobody wanted. It was basically the leftovers of leftovers. But it was all Germany had. They boiled it down, mixed it up, and tasted it. It wasn't Coca-Cola, but it was drinkable, sweet, a little sharp, something people could buy without ration stamps. When Keith told his team to use their imagination, one salesman, Joe Nip, snapped his fingers and said a single word, Fanta, short for fantasy. It stuck. By 1943, more than 3 million cases had been sold across the country. Housewives used it in stews and cakes. Because real ingredients were too expensive, kids treated it like dessert in a bottle. And the Nazi state pointed to it as proof that Germany didn't need American imports. It fit right into their message of self-reliance, even though Keith himself tried hard to keep the drink out of the propaganda spotlight. The part most people don't know? The formula kept changing. If the farms had apple scraps, Fanta tasted like apple. If they had beet fibers, it leaned that way. Every batch was a surprise because Germany's food supply was running on fumes, but it kept Coca-Cola Germany alive through the war. Then 1945 hit. The regime collapsed, and Keith did something that saved the company's future. He gathered every document, every production log, every sales sheet, every memo he'd kept hidden from the Nazi ministries, and handed it all to Coca-Cola's team when they arrived from Atlanta. He'd protected the brand during the war, and now he returned it. After that, Fanta vanished. For 10 whole years, no factories made it. No bottles were sold. It was almost like it had never existed. Then, in 1955, far from Germany, Coca-Cola Italy brought it back with a brand new recipe built on Mediterranean oranges. This time, it wasn't about survival. It was about expanding the company. And that version, bright orange, sweet, stable, became the Fanta the world knows today. It would go on to spread across Europe, then South America, then Asia. Different countries demanded different flavors. Melon in Japan, guarana in Brazil, berry mixes in Eastern Europe. By 1960, Coca-Cola officially absorbed the brand, and Fanta transformed from wartime improvisation into a global product. Today, it's Coca-Cola's second best-selling drink. Millions crack one open every day with zero idea where it came from. But Fanta is only the beginning, because if a soda could come out of Nazi Germany, wait until you see the inventions that shaped weapons, medicine, travel, and even the roads you drive on. The strange thing about digging into these Nazi inventions is how quickly the tone shifts. One moment you're talking about a soda made from scraps, and the next you're staring straight at a weapon that changed the way soldiers fight. And this one didn't come out of a kitchen or a factory scrambling to survive. It came out of a battlefield problem the German army had been carrying since the first shots of the war. By 1942, German infantry on the Eastern Front were stuck with the same old choices. The Karabiner 98K was solid and accurate, but it was slow. You had to work the bolt every time. When Soviet troops came rushing through the snow or smoke at 50 meters, that slow reload could cost you your life. The MP-40 fired faster, but its power dropped the moment you aimed past 100 meters. The war wasn't happening at long distances anymore. Most fights were happening inside villages, tree lines, burned-out barns, and broken city blocks. Under 400 meters, usually under 200. They needed something in the middle. Something fast, but still strong enough to hit farther than a submachine gun. That gap is what led the engineers in Sual to a new kind of round in 1942, the 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz. Not as long as the usual rifle cartridge, but more powerful than the pistol rounds the MP-40 used. It let soldiers fire more rounds with less kick, and that opened the door for a brand new type of weapon. The early version was called the Maschinenkarabiner 42. It looked rough, more like a prototype than a finished rifle. But under the metal frame, something important was taking shape. Hugo Schmeisser, the engineer behind many of Germany's firearms, kept pushing the design. He wanted something a regular infantryman could carry into a village, take cover behind a wall, and fire off a controlled burst without losing his aim. By 1944, the final form had arrived. Sturmgewehr 44. It means assault rifle. The name alone was something new, and the weapon lived up to it. You could switch between single shots and full automatic. You had a 30-round magazine you could reload quickly. It was heavy, close to 5 kilograms, but lighter and easier to manage than a traditional rifle, and that mid-power round made it possible for soldiers to fire fast without losing control. When it reached the Eastern Front, you could see the difference in the way German troops moved. They could run from one burned tractor to the next and lay down short bursts that kept Soviet troops pinned. Internal reports written in late 1944 even pointed out that units with these rifles took fewer losses. It let one soldier defend a wider area. It let small groups hold out longer. For a few months, you could feel the shift, but it came too late. Germany had fires burning everywhere. Factories were being hit by Allied bombers. Supply trains were breaking down. Even though more than 400,000 Saint G44s were built, the army never got enough of them to turn the tide. And when the war ended, the rifle scattered across Europe like fallen seeds. Other nations picked them up, studied them, took notes. By 1947, the AK-47 appeared in the Soviet Union with a similar idea behind it. Mid-power round, simple controls, fast firing. In the 1960s, the United States followed with the M16. Belgium built the FNFAL. West Germany built the G3. Different countries, different armies, but all tracing the same line back to that rifle born in a collapsing empire. And it makes you wonder what comes next, because the Saint G44 wasn't the only Nazi invention that shaped the world after the war, not by a long shot. The story picks up in the 1930s, right when the Nazi state wanted to show the world it could build a modern life for its people. One of the big ideas at the time was a cheap car that any worker could buy. They called it the KDF wagon, tied to a state program called Strength Through Joy. And this wasn't just a slogan. The plan came straight from Hitler himself in 1934, who stood on a stage in Berlin and laid out the rules. The car needed room for a family of 5. It had to sip fuel, stay simple to repair, and come at a price a factory worker could manage. The regime handed the project to Ferdinand Porsche, who had already spent years experimenting with small car designs. By 1938, his team had a working model, rounded shell, air-cooled engine in the back, a frame stripped of anything that wasn't needed. It looked nothing like the big American cars of the day, but that was the point. It was cheap to build and tough enough for long trips on Germany's new autobahns. A city rose around the factory meant to build it, a place called Wolfsburg. planned on maps before a single street existed. People were even told they could buy one by saving a few marks every week through a state-run stamp booklet. Thousands joined in, but the promise never came. Everything stopped in 1939 when the war began. Civilian production was canceled before the first family car could be delivered. The same line that was supposed to make a friendly little car now turned out military machines. First came the Kübelwagen, a boxy vehicle used by German troops from France to North Africa. Then the Schwimmwagen, an odd-looking amphibious car that showed up on muddy river crossings in the east. Both were based on Porsche's design, just reshaped for the battlefield. By 1945, the Wolfsburg plant was a wreck. Bombed roofs, broken machinery, scattered tools. Many thought the factory should be torn down because of its ties to the regime. But a British officer named Ivan Hurst saw something different. He walked through the ruined halls, found one car body still intact, and decided it was worth saving. Under his direction, workers cleaned the machines, fixed the presses, and tried again. This time, the car finally reached the people it had been promised to, not as a Nazi slogan, but as a plain, practical car called the Volkswagen. Post-war Germany needed anything that could move across rough roads and didn't guzzle fuel. The car fit that moment perfectly. Soldiers used it, civilians used it, police departments used it. It spread from Germany to the rest of Europe, then to America by the mid-1950s. In the United States, it found a home with younger drivers who liked how small and different it looked compared to giant chrome-covered cars. In Latin America, especially Mexico, factories kept it alive for decades. Because its simple engine could be fixed almost anywhere, the shape barely changed for more than 60 years. The final classic model rolled out of a plant in Puebla, Mexico in 2003, ending a long and strange journey that began in a dictatorship and ended as one of the world's most recognizable cars. But here's the part most people never wonder about. If a little car like this could travel so far from its roots, what else from that era took flight? Especially the machines built to cut through the sky. The first time Allied pilots saw it, they didn't even have a name for it. Just a blur over the clouds, and a voice shouting over the radio, "What was that? What the hell was that?" It was the summer of 1944, and Germany had just put something in the sky no one else had. The Messerschmitt Me 262 made its combat debut, and for a moment it felt like the future had arrived in the middle of a collapsing regime. The idea for this jet wasn't new. German engineers had been testing early designs since 1941, and the prototype took its first full jet-powered flight in July 1942. But getting it into service took longer than anyone expected. The plane used two Junkers Jumo 004 engines, the first workable turbojets used in combat, and those engines were both groundbreaking and ridiculously fragile. They pushed the aircraft past 870 kilometers an hour, faster than anything in the Allied arsenal, but they also burned out after a handful of hours if the pilot treated them the wrong way. Still, the speed was so shocking that many Me 262 pilots talked about having to throttle back just to aim their guns. Those guns were no joke. 4 30mm cannons sat in the nose, each one designed to break open the heavy bombers pouring into Germany. Day and night later versions even had racks of R-4M rockets under the wings, tiny weapons that could tear through a formation with just one volley. The mission was simple: climb fast, hit the bombers, and vanish before the escort fighters could close in. The Squadron JV-44 tried exactly that through late 1944 and early 1945. And whenever the jets actually got airborne, the results were brutal. But getting airborne was half the battle. The Me 262 needed long, perfect runways, and by 1944, Germany didn't have many of those left. Allied bombers hit every airfield they could find. The engines needed slow, careful throttling, or they would stall or melt. Mechanics struggled with fuel shortages, spare parts, and constant raids. It became a high-tech machine trapped in a country running out of everything. When the war ended, the jet didn't vanish. It was captured, crated up, and shipped to airfields in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. This was part of Operation Lusty, the Allied effort to grab every piece of advanced German tech before it could be destroyed or disappear. Test pilots everywhere got a turn with the Me 262. Eric Winkle Brown, a British pilot who flew more aircraft types than anyone in history, came away stunned. He said no other plane from the war felt so far ahead of its time, especially in how it let the pilot decide the fight instead of reacting to it. For a few years after the war, Czechoslovakia even built its own version, the Avia S-92, using leftover parts and airframes. They flew until the early 1950s. Later, in the United States, small groups built replicas for air shows, keeping the strange whistle of those engines alive long after the original factory fell quiet. The Me-262 didn't win the war, and it couldn't save the regime that built it, but it pushed aviation into a new age, one jet rush at a time. And once you see how far Nazi engineering reached, even in the air, you start to look down at the ground too, at the shoes people wore, the factories that made them, and the two brothers whose rivalry inside Hitler's Germany would end up shaping the global sports even to this day. Our story starts in a small Bavarian town in 1924, when two brothers, Adolf and Rudolf Dassler, set up a modest workshop they called the Gebrüder Dassler Schuhfabrik. They were making handmade athletic shoes long before anyone thought of sportswear as a global business. By the mid-1930s, their work caught the attention of coaches and athletes all over Europe. And then came the moment that pushed their shoes onto the world stage. Jesse Owens stepping onto the track at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, wearing a pair of Dassler spikes. 4 gold medals later, the brothers had proof that their tiny factory could shape the future of sport. But this success was tangled up in the reality of the country they lived in. Both Adi and Rudy joined the Nazi Party, like many business owners who wanted to stay in good standing with the state. Their factory in Herzogenaurach didn't sit outside the system. It helped where it was asked to help, especially once war began in 1939. The focus on sports shoes faded. Military needs pulled the factory into the wartime economy, just as they did with so many German companies of that era. The story wasn't neat or heroic. It was complicated, and the brothers' partnership grew heavy with tension. By the time the war ended in 1945, whatever held the Dasslers together had snapped. Their split became so bitter that people in Herzogenaurach still talk about it like a family tragedy. Rudy walked out and set up his own company on one side of town. He called it Puma. Adi kept the original factory and renamed his new, smaller company using a mix of his own name, Adidas. What had been one business turned into 2 rivals staring at each other across the same river, hiring from the same families, and trying to outsell each other in the same streets. From there, each brother built his future in a different way. Adi leaned toward the technical side of sport. Better studs, better traction shoes that solved problems for soccer players and runners. His 3-stripe mark, first used in the late 1940s, slowly transformed into a symbol recognized almost anywhere someone kicked a ball. Rudy took a sharper commercial approach. He worked closely with athletes, making deals that pushed Puma into locker rooms where new stars were rising. His design stood out in a way that felt bold for the era. By the 1950s and 60s, their fight had gone global, with both brands showing up at World Cups, Olympic tracks, and national training centers. As the decades rolled on, the two companies outgrew the argument that created them. Adidas climbed into the top tier of sports manufacturers, building research labs, opening offices around the world, and selling gear in more than 160 countries. Puma grew too, leaner, sometimes smaller, but always present, mixing high-performance products with a style that reached far beyond stadiums. Their hometown, Herzogenaurach, still holds both headquarters. What used to be a family feud is now a town where 2 giants quietly coexist, each trying to stay one step ahead of the other. And when you step back and look at where it all began, a small workshop, 2 brothers who couldn't stand each other, and a war pulling everyone in directions they didn't choose, you start to see how deep the fingerprints of that time really go. The shoes athletes wear today can trace their roots straight into that split inside Nazi Germany. 2 global brands born from one house, one feud, and one regime. And if something as harmless as sports gear came out of that era, it makes you wonder what else slipped forward from those same production lines. The kind of designs that weren't meant for feet at all, but for sending a weapon across the sky and watching it fall. The V-2 didn't look like the future when it first appeared. It looked like a weapon built to end cities. In 1944, when the first ones arced over the English Channel, people on the ground never heard them coming. No engine roar, no warning whistle, just a sudden explosion, a shock wave, then dust and fire. That silence came from its speed. The V-2 was the first long-range ballistic missile ever used in war, and the first human-made object to slip into the edge of space. It rose faster than sound, so it arrived before the air could even carry its voice. The man behind it was Wernher von Braun, a young engineer who had dreamed of space since he was a boy in Germany. But by the late 1930s, those dreams were tied to the German army. They gave him money, people, and a testing site on the Baltic coast called Peenemünde. There, his team pushed rocket design far beyond anything the world had seen. By the middle of the war, the V-2 stood nearly 14 meters tall, burning liquid oxygen and alcohol to drive itself into the sky. And every time it launched, it carried the hopes of a regime desperate for a miracle weapon. The rockets came down on cities like London, Antwerp, and Liège from September 1944 until the final months of the war. More than 3,000 were fired. There was no way to shoot them down. No radar system could react fast enough. Even when the Allies bombed the factories and tried to choke the supply lines, the launches kept going. Each strike killed civilians at random. For many in the target cities, the V-2 felt less like a weapon and more like a curse that fell out of the clouds. But the most hidden part of the story was how these rockets were built. After Peenemünde was bombed in 1943, production moved underground into a vast tunnel network called Mittelwerk. Thousands of prisoners from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp were forced to build the rockets. Many died from starvation, disease, beatings, or simple exhaustion. More people lost their lives building V-2s than were killed by the rockets themselves. It was technology pushed forward by suffering the world wasn't supposed to see. When the war ended in 1945, the race to seize the rocket teams and their work began almost overnight. American forces collected von Braun and more than 100 of his engineers and brought them to the United States in a program later called Operation Paperclip. They were sent first to Fort Bliss in Texas, then to the White Sands Range in New Mexico. In 1946, the first captured V-2 lifted off from that desert floor. Soon after, American engineers stacked a small American-made research rocket on top of a V-2 and created the bumper whack. One of these became the first rocket launched from Cape Canaveral in 1950. The Soviet Union took its own share of engineers and hardware. Under tight control, German specialists helped them build the R-1, a close copy of the V-2, followed by the R-2 and the R-5M. By the mid-1950s, the R-5M was ready to carry a nuclear warhead. The Soviets even shared the R-2 design with China, giving Beijing the foundation for its first ballistic missile program. Back in the United States, von Braun's group moved again, this time to Huntsville, Alabama. There they built the Redstone missile. It first flew in 1953 and later became the first American missile to carry a live nuclear warhead during a test flight. The Redstone line also led to the booster that would one day lift the first American astronaut into space. And all of this grew out of one wartime rocket that fell without a sound. What came next pushed the world into a brand new chapter, one race at a time. But another thread from that same era runs through something far more familiar, resting in garages and driveways today, quietly carrying its own shadow. BMW's story doesn't start with smooth engines or quiet cabins. It starts in the middle of a war machine. By the early 1940s, the company was building some of the most important engines the Luftwaffe had. The BMW 801 powered planes like the Focke-Wulf 190, one of the main fighters Germany used over Europe. Then came the BMW 003, a jet engine tested in 1940 and pushed into service during the last years of the war. On the ground, BMW built the R75 motorcycle with its heavy sidecar, the one meant to haul soldiers across rough terrain on the Eastern Front. All of it was part of the same goal: keep the Nazi war effort moving. Behind those machines were thousands of forced laborers. Many were brought in from camps linked to Dachau and made to work inside BMW facilities. They built parts under guards, under threat, often underground after Allied bombers started striking industrial sites. It was dangerous work with no choice and no way out, and a large number of them never survived the conditions. This is the part of the story the company had to reckon with years later, long after the shooting stopped. When the war finally ended in 1945, BMW was almost wiped out. Allied bombing had shattered its main plants, and the company wasn't allowed to build engines or vehicles anymore. To stay alive, it made whatever it could: pots, pans, bicycles, anything that didn't need an engine. Only in 1948 was BMW allowed to build motorcycles again. 4 years later, in 1952, the first post-war car rolled out: the BMW 501 sedan. It was big and elegant, but it didn't sell well enough to pull the company out of trouble. By 1959, things were so bad that BMW almost disappeared into Daimler-Benz. That takeover would have ended the brand right there. Instead, a rescue came from the Quandt family, which bought a major share of the company. Their fortune had grown during the Third Reich, and their investment kept BMW independent. With new money and a clear direction, the company began to rebuild itself. The real change arrived in the early 1960s with a group of cars called the Neue Klasse. These weren't heavy sedans. They were lighter, sharper, quicker. They gave BMW a new identity, sporty but refined. That shift carried into the 1970s with the launch of the 3, 5, 6, and 7 series. Then came the M division in 1978, starting with the M1, which pushed BMW deeper into performance engineering. For the first time, the company had a lineup that matched the future it wanted. Over the next decades, BMW spread across the world. It added Mini, then Rolls-Royce. It built factories in the United States, China, Mexico, South Africa, Brazil, and more. In 2013, it stepped into electric cars with the i3 and i8, two models that made other automakers take the EV shift seriously. Today, the company works on battery tech, autonomous systems, and new ways to connect cars to their drivers. In many places, BMW is now part of art shows, museums, and sports events. It's woven into culture in ways the founders of those wartime engines never could have imagined. Once you walk the story backward, past the luxury, past the ads, past all the polished engineering, you end up right back in those wartime workshops. You see the engines that kept the Luftwaffe flying. You see the forced labor that kept the production lines moving. And when you realize how much of that world still echoes today, you start noticing something else too. Some ideas from that era weren't just tucked away in factories. Some of them were poured straight into the ground, stretched across Germany in long, clean lines. And most people don't even know where those roads really came from. If you've ever driven a fast, open highway with no crossroads and no stoplights, you've already touched a piece of history most people never think about. The idea didn't start with a friendly push for better travel. It took shape in Germany in the early 1930s, right after Hitler came to power in 1933. The plan was simple on the surface: build a web of high-speed roads that tied the whole country together. But underneath the posters and speeches, the project worked as a giant stage for the regime to show off what it called a new Germany. The concept of a national highway wasn't new. Engineers in the Weimar years had their own sketches. What changed was the scale and the speed. By late 1933, the first official routes were announced, and the ground was broken with big crowds and staged celebrations. Hitler appeared at several openings. walking along fresh pavement while cameras rolled.
Hier beginnen wir nunmehr neue Schlagadern zu bauen. Wir haben 4 Jahre damals uns ausgebeten und wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen zum Nutzen und Frommen unseres deutschen Volkes. Damit wohl in erster Linie für den deutschen Arbeiter.
The whole thing was sold as proof that unemployment was falling, that the country was rising again, and that everything was moving in one direction. Out on the construction sites, the reality looked different. Thousands of workers did get hired, but a growing share of the labor came from political prisoners, persecuted groups, and later prisoners of war camps supplied workers to certain stretches, especially as the push for speed grew in the late 1930s. The roads were built fast, but they were built to a standard that surprised visitors. Engineers planned smooth curves, so drivers didn't need to slow down. They added wide lanes, raised bridges, rest stops, and long sweeping views that blended into the landscape. These roads weren't just public works, they were a message. The regime used them to show order, unity, and control. Maps were printed as propaganda pieces, posters showed families driving toward a bright horizon. It was meant to feel like a new national heartbeat. Even though people often assume the Autobahn was built mainly for military use, its wartime value was more limited than expected. Tanks and equipment still moved mostly by rail. But for everyday life inside Germany, the difference was huge. A driver could travel long distances without stopping, something unheard of in most countries at the time. And that caught attention. One person who paid close attention was Dwight D. Eisenhower. He had seen the chaos of American roads during World War I. Then during and after World War II, when he crossed Germany, he saw the Autobahn system up close. The speed, the design, the uninterrupted flow. It stuck with him. By 1956, as president, he pushed through the Federal Aid Highway Act. That single decision laid down the backbone of the interstate highway system, thousands of miles of smooth, divided, non-stop roads, shaped by what he'd seen overseas. From there, the model spread. Country after country copied the basic idea. Long, wide, grade-separated highways built for speed and efficiency. Today, millions of people drive on versions of it without ever knowing where the template really came from. And when you see how those roads carried themselves right out of that era and into the world we use today, you start to think about all the other things that made the same quiet jump designs that weren't just about steel or concrete, but about how people were meant to look and move and present themselves. It makes you stop for a second and ask what else from those years walked forward looking sharp, polished, and strangely familiar. Have you ever noticed how the SS looked strangely put together in those old photos? Like weirdly stylish in a way nobody wants to admit out loud? And doesn't that make you wonder how that look got so polished in the first place? It sure wasn't an accident, and it didn't start in some fashion studio in Berlin. It started in a small workshop in Metzingen, long before anyone imagined the name Hugo Boss would end up on billboards and runways. Back in the early 1930s, Hugo Ferdinand Boss was just trying to keep his shop alive. He was sewing work shirts, raincoats, simple stuff. Then the Nazis rose to power in 1933, and suddenly the country needed uniforms. Lots of them. The SA needed brown shirts. The SS wanted those sharp black coats with clean cuts that gave them that cold, commanding look. The Hitler Youth needed outfits for marches and drills, and Hugo Boss got contracts for all of it. One order opened the door to another, and before long, this quiet little workshop found itself sewing the visual identity of the regime. And here's the part most people don't think about. Those uniforms were designed to send a message. Straight lines, strong shoulders, dark colors. They weren't about comfort, they were about control and fear. And even though Hugo Boss wasn't the only company on the job, his firm definitely grew from those contracts. More staff, bigger production rooms, more money coming in. Then the war hit, and things got even darker. To keep up with demand, the company used forced laborers, people pulled from occupied territories or taken as prisoners of war. These workers stitched uniforms under rough conditions, day in and day out. It's one of those facts that sat quietly in the attic for decades, but the records are clear. That part can't be separated from the brand's early success. After the war, everything changed. There were denazification hearings. Hugo Boss himself was labeled a follower, someone who went along with the regime and gained from it. There were fines, reputation damage, and then in 1948 he passed away. Most companies would have sunk right there. But somehow, the brand didn't die. New leadership took over. By the 1950s, the company moved far away from its past and focused on men's suits. And funny enough, the clean, sharp look stayed. But now it was aimed at businessmen, not soldiers. By the 1980s and 90s, the name Hugo Boss was everywhere, tied to sports sponsorships, glossy ads, movie stars. The brand went global, selling in over 100 countries, pushing out sleek suits and later entire lifestyle lines. By 2023, they were doing over 4 billion euros in sales with nearly 20,000 employees. Still, once you know where that sharp look started, it's hard not to connect the dots. A style meant to project power in the 1930s quietly slid into modern fashion, and most people wearing a Boss suit today have no idea what the company once made. And if a shift that big could slide right past everyone, you have to wonder what else from that era lived on. Maybe even the little pills they handed out to keep soldiers wired. The kind of thing that never really disappeared, just changed its name. Have you ever wondered how German soldiers kept going for days without sleep? No coffee, no breaks, just constant movement as if the war itself was pulling them forward. The secret wasn't discipline. In the late 1930s, a Berlin company called Temmler produced a small white pill called Pervitin. At first it was sold like a regular stimulant, but military doctors soon noticed it wiped out fatigue almost instantly, and the army snapped it up. By the time Blitzkrieg rolled across Europe in 1939 and 1940, Pervitin was everywhere. Tank crews carried it in their kits, pilots tucked it into flight jackets, and infantry soldiers swallowed it before night marches, stretching dozens of kilometers. Men felt unstoppable, eyes wide and energy pumping. Generals believed it gave them a real edge, and for a while, it did. But the pill had a darker side. Soldiers became paranoid, irritable, and addicted. Still, the high command focused on short-term results, handing out millions of tablets in 1940 alone. By 1944, experimentation went further. Researchers developed D-Ikes, a mix of methamphetamine, cocaine, and morphine, tested on prisoners to see how far humans could push without food, rest, or fear. The experiments were cruel and never fully deployed, but they showed how far the regime would go to chemically enhance soldiers. After the war, Pervitin lingered briefly under prescription before disappearing. Its core chemical, N-methylamphetamine, became the foundation for post-war research. In the US, derivatives like desoxin emerged, while clandestine labs elsewhere reproduced the formula. The pill that once powered Blitzkrieg marches eventually shaped the global meth trade. A tiny pill from the 1930s, Berlin changed warfare and later the world of drugs. And if that one invention could ripple through decades, imagine the strange flying wing built in 1944 that inspired the B-2 spirit. That story takes flight in the next chapter. Right as the war turned against Germany, two brothers began sketching a plane no one had seen before. Reimar and Walter Horten, Luftwaffe officers and dreamers, had been exploring the flying wing concept since the early 1930s. No tail, no fuselage, just a smooth triangle slicing through the sky. When the Nazi high command demanded an aircraft that could outrun Allied fighters, dodge radar, and still carry bombs, the Hortens pushed their idea forward. The first Ho-2-29 flew in early 1944 without jets, proving the shape could be stable. The second prototype, fitted with two Jumo 004 jet engines, could reach nearly 800 kilometers per hour, close to the fastest Allied planes. A test flight in February 1945 ended in disaster, killing the pilot. Even then, development continued. A third, stronger version using metal and wood composites was under construction when American troops captured it in April 1945. The jet was shipped to the US, dissected at Wright Field. Radar was crude then, and the Ho-229's stealth potential wasn't fully appreciated. It stayed in storage for decades, an odd relic from the war's final days. But by the 1970s and 80s, radar-guided missiles made invisibility essential. The Flying Wing's old sketches started looking visionary. When the B-2 Spirit appeared in 1988, aviation experts noticed the similarities: sweeping wings, blended body, edges designed to avoid detection. Engineers insist it wasn't copied, but the principles of low radar visibility clearly trace back to the Horten brothers. Tests on a 2000S full-scale replica confirmed a radar signature far lower than other planes of its era. Seeing how ideas from 1944 still shaped modern aircraft makes you wonder, what else survived the war, quietly influencing the world today? And if a jet could do that, imagine what a code machine might have carried forward. It is funny how something that once sat on a German officer's desk now sits behind almost every message we send. Enigma did not look like the start of a digital revolution. It looked like a chunky typewriter built in the 1920s, all metal edges and stiff keys. But inside it, wires and rotors carried out a dance that no human could follow at speed. Each tap sent a current through 3 spinning wheels and a plug board on the front. The result was a letter that changed every single time. Press A 10 times, and you would get 10 different answers. That strange behavior is what made German commanders so confident. They believed no one could ever keep up. The trick was that the whole system depended on the settings. The rotors had to start in the right position. The plugboard cables had to be matched the same way on both machines. When crews in Berlin sent out their daily key sheets, they were really handing out the secret recipe. Without those sheets, the Allies faced a wall of letters that looked like noise. For a long stretch in the early years of the war, that noise kept German submarines fed and fueled, because Allied ships could not read a single warning in time. But even perfect machines make small mistakes, and Enigma had one built into its design. It refused to ever turn a letter into itself. That tiny detail mattered, because German radio operators also loved routine phrases. A weather officer might open with the same greeting every morning. A patrol boat might sign off the same way each night. In 1939, at a quiet estate in Buckinghamshire called Bletchley Park, these habits became a lifeline. Alan Turing and the team around him noticed those patterns. They built the bomb, a machine that could test through rotor settings faster than any person. It did not solve the whole message on its own, but it cut the number of possible keys down to a short list. After that, a small group of codebreakers checked the final few by hand. By 1941, the Allies could read whole streams of German traffic. By 1942, they were doing it nearly every day. That effort pushed the British to build something even larger. In 1943, engineers pulled together thousands of vacuum tubes to create Colossus at a factory in Hertfordshire. It was the first machine that could be programmed with switches and paper tape to attack a changing code system. Its speed shocked even the people who built it. Messages that once took days to untangle could be cleared in hours. Back in 1976, the Diffie-Hellman method changed the game by letting 2 strangers create a shared key, even on a connection that might be watched. That cleared a path for encrypted chat, cloud backups, and all the quiet things your phone does in the background. And then digital certificates stepped in so you could be sure the other side of the line was real. Every time you tap your bank app or check your Apple Wallet, those certificates are working in the background, proving the identity of the server before any money moves. It feels normal now, but the bones of the system reach back to a machine once carried in a leather case by German radio crews. If a single device like that could echo into our phones, our banks, and our wallets, imagine what other secrets from those workshops might still be running quietly in the background. Machines, designs, ideas, shaping the world without most of us even realizing. Have you ever wondered why the Olympic torch relay feels like it's always been part of the games? The truth is, it didn't exist before 1936. That year in Berlin, the Nazis created a brand new spectacle to link themselves to the glory of ancient Greece. Karl Diem, the organizer, mapped a route from Olympia to Berlin, nearly 3,000 kilometers through 7 countries. Over 3,000 torches were built by Krupp, a company better known for steel and weapons, designed to keep the flame alive in all conditions. The relay was filmed by Leni Riefenstahl, and it wasn't just sports footage, it was propaganda. Each handoff, each torchbearer, was choreographed to make Germany look like the rightful heir to a heroic past. Soldiers, students, and athletes carried the flame, turning the journey into a story of national pride. The ritual, designed to impress, worked so well that the International Olympic Committee decided to keep it, transforming a political stunt into a global tradition. After the war, the origins of the relay were largely forgotten, but the idea stuck. Since then, the flame has traveled on ships, planes, and high-speed trains, crossing continents and oceans. Every Olympics now includes a relay, with host countries adding symbolic touches. Torches have evolved too. The ones used at Tokyo 2020 were made from recycled aluminum from disaster recovery housing, combining modern engineering with a nod to history. Yet the basic concept, a traveling flame connecting people across distance, traces directly back to Berlin in 1936. It's striking how something created for a dark, political purpose became a symbol of unity and celebration. The torch reminds us that inventions can outgrow their origins. Decades later, the shadow of those years is still with us. BMW, Hugo Boss, Adidas, even the Fanta in your fridge. Products that outlived the regime that spawned them. Rockets, jets, drugs, encryption, tools once made for war now power travel, fashion, sports, and technology. We enjoy them without thinking about their origins, but that past lingers. Recognizing it isn't just history, it's a warning. Innovation under pressure can be brilliant, useful, and deadly all at once. And if these ideas survived, what else from that era is still shaping our world, quietly, right under our noses?